The fence is still the same fence. 30 years of paint have gone over that chain link, and still it sags in the same place, right where the third-grade windows look out onto the bus lane, like something leaned on it once and it never quite forgot the weight. He stands there now, with his hands wrapped around the top rail, an old man in a leather vest gone soft and gray at the seams, and he does not go in. You should know, before this goes any further, that what happened at this school on one Friday morning in October was never supposed to matter to anyone beyond a single classroom, a single hour, a single boy who did not give his name to anyone who would remember to write it down. You should know that a bell is going to ring today, the last bell this building will ever ring before the wrecking crews come for it, and that when it rings, something is going to close that has been open, quietly, for 3 decades. Stay for that. Stay for the bell. But first, go back. Go back 30 years, to a town called Black Ridge, the kind of town that shows up on a map only because the highway has to call it something. Go back to a Wednesday in October, cold enough that the gas station attendant had his collar up, cold enough that the biker fueling his motorcycle at the pump could see his own breath curling up past the patches on his vest. He was not young then either. He had gray already coming into his beard, a tour of Vietnam already folded somewhere behind his eyes, and a son somewhere in another state he had not spoken to in 6 years, over a fight so old neither one of them could name it plainly anymore. He was deacon then, same as he is deacon now, the name patched under the insignia of a club called the Iron Ridge Riders, and on that Wednesday he was only passing through, the way men like him were always only passing through. He did not see the boy walk up. That was the first thing he'd remember, later, how quiet the boy had been, how he'd simply appeared at the edge of the pump island in a coat too thin for the weather, sneakers with no socks, staring up at the patches like they were a language he already half understood. The boy did not ask his name. He did not ask where he was headed, or how long he'd ridden, or any of the things children usually ask a stranger straddling a loud machine. He asked if the man would be his dad, for 1 hour. Deacon did not answer right away. He would tell you, if he told this story at all, and he rarely did, that the wind had picked up just then, dry and sharp off the ridge, and that for a moment all he could hear was the tick of the cooling engine and a boy's voice, flat and practiced, like he'd rehearsed the sentence 100 times walking to school and back. He said no. He got back on his bike, and he rode away, and he told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. He rode the long way back to the clubhouse that afternoon, out past the grain silos and the shuttered feed store, the wind carrying the smell of diesel and cut hay, and he did not think about the boy so much as he tried not to. That was how it worked. At 70-some years and 40-some since the war, a man learned to steer his mind the way he steered the bike. Small corrections, nothing sudden, never looking too long at what waited off to the side of the road. He had gotten good at it. He had needed to. Black Ridge in October wore its poverty plainly. The cornfields had gone to stubble, gray gold under a sky the color of dishwater, and the wind that came down off the ridge that time of year had teeth in it, the kind that found the gaps in a coat 2 sizes wrong for the season. He had noticed the boy's coat. He had told himself he hadn't, and then he noticed that he'd told himself that, and there was a particular kind of tiredness in catching your own lie twice in one afternoon. He had a son once who wore coats like that, thin ones, because the good coat was always at the cleaner's, or too small by the time the check cleared. That was 30 years back now, more, and the boy who'd worn them was a grown man in another state who did not answer the phone when Deacon's name came up on it, not for 6 years running, over a fight so old neither of them could have said, if pressed, what the actual words had been, only that neither would say sorry first. Pride was a heavy thing to carry on a bike. It didn't show in the saddlebags, but it rode there all the same. He told himself the boy at the gas station would forget about it by Monday. Kids forgot things. Kids found other men to ask, teachers, neighbors, uncles, who existed somewhere in the tangle of a family tree, even when fathers didn't. He told himself this while he cleaned his carburetor that evening, in the cold light of the garage, and he told himself this the next morning over coffee that had gone bitter from sitting too long on the burner, and he was still telling himself this 2 nights later, when Tin Man mentioned, offhand, that he needed cigarettes, and did Deacon want to ride into town with him, seeing as neither of them had anywhere better to be. The wagon wheel was open at that hour, mostly out of habit more than commerce. A long, low building with a sign missing its second O, 3 trucks in the gravel lot, and 1 waitress behind the counter, refilling a ketchup bottle from another ketchup bottle, moving like a woman, keeping herself upright through sheer repetition. Deacon didn't know her face yet. He didn't know, sitting down on that vinyl stool with his knees aching from the cold, that he was about to. The name tag pinned crooked above her breast pocket read a name he would come to know well enough later, though that night it was just a strip of plastic catching the fluorescent light. She was maybe 35 going on 60, the kind of tired that lived in the shoulders and not just the face, and she poured coffee for Tin Man without being asked, because some instinct in her still ran on autopilot even at that hour. Deacon ordered eggs he didn't want. Tin Man bought his cigarettes from the rack by the register and lingered, the way he did, sensing something before Deacon did. She dropped a fork, not loud, a small clatter against linoleum, and when she bent to pick it up, she stayed down a beat too long, one hand braced on her knee, and when she rose, her eyes had gone somewhere past the counter, past the parking lot, past the dark fields beyond the sign with the missing O. Long shift, Deacon said. Not a question. Double, she said. Some weeks it's all doubles. He watched her hands while she talked, the way a man watches machinery for the tell of a coming failure. Chapped knuckles. A ring she still wore on a chain around her neck instead of her finger, tucked under her collar, visible only when she leaned to wipe the counter. She mentioned, to no one, to the air, that she needed to get home before her boy woke up for school, that he was getting old enough now to make his own breakfast if she didn't, and something in the way she said, his own breakfast. Proud and ashamed of the pride at once, made Deacon set his fork down. He asked what grade the boy was in. 3rd, she said. 8 years old, growing too fast. Quiet lately, quieter than he used to be, though she supposed that was the year doing what it did to him. She said this without asking why a stranger wanted to know, because in a place like the wagon wheel at that hour, small talk was the only currency anyone had left to spend. Deacon didn't tell her about the gas station. He didn't tell her that 2 nights from now her son would stand in front of a classroom holding a lie together with both hands, alone, because he hadn't wanted to add his mother's absence to the list of things she already carried. He paid for the eggs he hadn't eaten, and left too much on the table, the way men do when money is the only apology available to them. Outside, the cold came down clean and hard off the ridge, and Tin Man lit his cigarette and asked, without looking over, what Deacon was thinking. Deacon didn't answer right away. He was still counting, in his head, the days he had left to change his mind. He didn't answer Tin Man that night, not really. He said something about the wind picking up, something about needing to check his chain before the ride back, and Tin Man let it sit the way old friends let things sit when they already know the answer is coming, just not yet dressed for company. They rode back to Black Ridge's clubhouse in silence, the 2 of them, headlights cutting through a dark that smelled of wood smoke and the first hard frost of the season, and Deacon kept seeing her, not the boy, not yet, but the mother, the particular way her shoulders had rounded forward over that coffee cup like she was trying to fold herself smaller, into something that took up less of the world's patience. He had seen that posture before, on the porch of his own house, some winters back, before his son stopped answering the phone. His late wife used to sit like that near the end, when the bills came faster than the checks did, and he had told himself then that a man's job was to stand up straighter so somebody in the house didn't have to. He didn't sleep well. He lay on the bunk in the back room of the clubhouse listening to the propane heater tick and thought about the boy's hands, how they'd gripped the pump nozzle at the gas station like it was the only solid thing in a world gone soft at the edges. 8 years old, 3rd grade, a father 14 months in the ground and a mother pulling doubles so the lights stayed on, and somewhere between those 2 facts, a boy had looked at a stranger's vest and decided that patches meant something steady enough to borrow. By morning, he still hadn't decided anything, or told himself he hadn't, which was its own kind of decision dressed up to look undecided. He found Patch in the garage bay, elbow deep in a carburetor that didn't need her attention nearly as much as her hands needed something to do, while she waited for him to say what he'd come to say. "Kid's career day is Friday," he said. She didn't stop working. "That where you were?" "Boy asked me to stand in for his father. 2 days ago. at the pump. Patch set the wrench down slow, the way she did when a thing mattered enough to require both hands free. You tell him no. I told him no. But he looked at the frost still clinging to the garage's high windows, at the pale light coming through it thin as skimmed milk, and thought again of the mother's shoulders, the boy's hands on the nozzle, the 14 months since a quarry had taken a man out of a family without so much as the courtesy of a warning. I'm going back on it, he said. Patch didn't say anything for a while. She picked the wrench back up, turned it over once in her hand like she was checking it for something that wasn't there, then set it down again on the workbench, final this time. You know what you're asking, she said. I'm not asking. You're telling a woman you never met that a man she never met is going to sit in a third-grade classroom and pretend to be somebody he isn't. I'm not going to pretend to be her husband. I'm going to be a man who talks to a boy about what he does for a living. That's all career day is. That's not all it is to the boy. He didn't answer that, because there wasn't an answer, and Patch had a way of putting a thing down in front of a man so plainly that arguing with it only proved her point twice. She wiped her hands on a rag gone black years ago and looked at him the way she looked at an engine that ran rough, not with suspicion, just attention. You're not doing this for the kid, she said. I am. You're doing it because somewhere in your head there's a boy your own son's age, and you missed his career day, or his ball game, or something, and you can't fix that one, so you're going to go fix this one instead. He didn't deny it, which was its own kind of answer, and she let the silence sit there a moment before she nodded, once, like she'd gotten the confession she'd been fishing for and didn't need to press further. Tin Man's not going to like it, she said. Him showing up at a school, in any capacity. He doesn't have to like it. He'll come anyway, you know that. I know that. She picked the wrench up a third time, and this time she went back to the carburetor in earnest. The conversation apparently settled to whatever degree it was going to get settled, though he stood there another minute anyway, watching her hands move with the same patience she brought to everything, waiting to see if she had more to say. She did. You go in colors, you'll scare half that classroom and every parent in the parking lot, she said, not looking up. You go dressed down. No cuts. Just men. Just men, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made it sound like a thing he hadn't been in a long time, not since a draft board had made the decision for him at 19 and never quite let him go back to being ordinary after. Outside, the frost was starting to give up its hold on the windows, the pale light thickening towards something like morning proper, and somewhere across town a boy was getting up for school, not knowing whether the promise he'd extracted from a stranger at a gas pump would hold, or whether Friday would come the way Fridays usually did, with nobody arriving at all. Tin Man was the one who found the wood. He did not ask why Deacon wanted it, or what it was for, only listened to the shape of the request, something small, something a boy could hold in one hand, something that would still be there after everything else had been forgotten, and went out to the scrap pile behind the garage where the good maple was kept, the pieces too small for cabinet work but too fine to burn. He came back with a block no bigger than a bar of soap and set it on the workbench without a word, the way he set most things down, like the object itself was the sentence, and anything he might add would only weaken it. Deacon worked it that night, alone in the back of the garage under a single bulb, the radio turned low to a station that played the kind of music men his age had stopped admitting they still liked. He was not a carver by trade. He had whittled as a boy in a Kentucky yard that no longer existed, and again in a jungle where a knife and a piece of wood had been one of the only ways to keep his hands from remembering what they'd been trained for, and the habit had stayed with him, the way habits from bad years always do, outlasting the years themselves. He turned the block over twice before he made the first cut, feeling for where the grain wanted to go, and then he began taking away everything that was not a motorcycle, the way his father had once told him you were supposed to do it, though his father had been talking about a horse, and Deacon had never once carved a horse in his life. The wheels came first, then the long low line of the tank, then the handlebars, which he made small and careful, and slightly too thick, because an 8-year-old's hands would close around them, and he did not want the first thing broken to be the first thing given. He did not sand it that night. He wanted to sleep on it, the way he wanted to sleep on the whole idea, half hoping in the morning it would look foolish enough in the daylight that he could set it aside and call the matter closed. It did not look foolish in the morning. It looked like a small, unfinished promise sitting on a workbench, catching the window light, and when Patch came in early to open the garage, she picked it up without asking and turned it over in her fingers for a long moment before she set it back down exactly where she'd found it. The front wheel pointed toward the door, as though even the wood understood there was somewhere it needed to go on Friday, whether or not the man who'd carved it had fully decided to take it there. She didn't say anything about it, which was its own kind of statement. Patch had never been a woman who wasted words on things that were already decided, and she seemed to have decided something looking at that unfinished motorcycle. Some private accounting she kept behind her eyes and did not share. She went to the coffee pot instead, filled 2 cups without asking if he wanted one, and set his down beside the wood shavings still curled on the bench like pale commas. "You're not doing this alone," she said, and it was not a question, and he did not treat it as one. He told her what the boy had said at the gas station, the exact words, because he found he remembered them exactly, the way a man remembers the read on a gauge right before something breaks. "Be my dad for 1 hour." He told her about the diner, the mother's shoulders, the coffee going cold at her elbow, while she wrote figures on a napkin that were never going to add up, no matter how long she stared at them. Patch listened with her cup halfway to her mouth and did not interrupt, and when he was done, she set the cup down without drinking from it. "Tin Man should come too," she said. "Man, that classroom sees 3 of us instead of 1. It stops being strange. It starts being real." He hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right, the way she was usually right about the arithmetic of how people read a room. One biker at a school on a Friday morning was a curiosity, maybe a small alarm somewhere in a front office phone call. 3, dressed down, no colors, coffee in hand instead of a helmet. That was something closer to ordinary. That was a shape a 9-year-old's classroom could hold without flinching. Tin Man, when they told him that evening in the yard behind the clubhouse, didn't ask a single question about the boy or the mother or the reasons. He asked only what time, and whether he should wear the boots with the steel toe or the ones that didn't announce him quite so loud walking into a room full of children, and that was the whole of his agreeing. By Wednesday night the carving still sat unsanded on the bench, and Deacon had still told no one, not Patch, not Tin Man, not even himself in so many words, that he had already decided to give it away rather than keep it as a private thing he'd made and set on a shelf. He only knew that every time he passed the workbench he picked it up and turned it the way Patch had, feeling the places where the wood still needed smoothing, the handlebars a little too thick for his own hand, and exactly right, he suspected, for a smaller one. Friday was 2 days off. The napkin was still folded in his jacket pocket, softened at the creases from being carried. Thursday came in gray, the kind of gray that sat low over Black Ridge and never quite decided to rain. Deacon rode to the diner before his shift at the garage, told himself it was for coffee and nothing else, and sat at the counter where he could see the kitchen pass through without seeming to look at it. She was there, same apron, a fresh burn along one forearm that hadn't been there Sunday. She moved like a woman, keeping time with a song only she could hear, fast and even, and tired past the place where tired shows on a face. When she poured his coffee, she didn't recognize him from the register, didn't recognize him from anything, because to her he was only a stranger in a leather vest who tipped well and didn't talk much, and that was fine. That was the arrangement he wanted. He left $2 more than he needed to and did not tell her why. At the garage he ran a compression test on a farm truck and thought about the boy's hands on that napkin, folding it the way you fold something you plan to keep. He thought about Mrs. Halloran's name written in the boy's careful print, 3rd grade cursive not yet earned, and about how a child does not ask a stranger for something unless every other door in his life has already been tried and found shut. He did not think this in those words. He thought it the way a man thinks about weather, as a pressure behind the eyes. That evening he sanded the motorcycle by lamplight, slow passes with fine paper, until the handlebars lost their roughness and took on the dull gleam of something touched many times. He did not varnish it. He wanted it to look made, not bought. Wanted the boy, if he was the kind of boy who noticed such things, to see the tool marks and know a person's hands had done this, not a machine's. Patch came by near 9 and stood in the doorway of the garage without being asked in, watching him work the way she watched engines when she was deciding whether to trust one. "You're not doing this for the boy," she said. He didn't look up. "Then who?" "I don't know yet. That's the part that worries me." He set the carving down and turned it so the headlamp faced the door, faced her, faced whatever she meant by that. Outside, the wind picked up along Route 9, carrying the smell of diesel and cut hay, and somewhere past the tree line a dog barked twice and went quiet. Patch didn't say anything else. She looked at the little wooden motorcycle a long moment, the way she'd looked at it in the daylight 2 days before, and then she looked at him instead, and whatever she saw there she kept to herself, and went to find Tin Man to talk about boots. The boots came up because Tin Man believed in them the way some men believed in Scripture. He'd ridden 200,000 miles convinced that a man's feet told you more about him than his mouth ever would, and he did not intend to walk into a third-grade classroom in the same steel toes he wore to break down engine blocks. He laid 3 pairs across the workbench like evidence, the scuffed ones, the church ones, the ones he'd worn to his own daughter's wedding 20 years back before she stopped answering his calls too, though that was a different silence than the one Deacon carried, older and more forgiven. Patch didn't say what she'd seen in the garage doorway. She picked up the wedding boots, turned them over, set them down. "These. Too much," Tin Man said. "He's 8. He won't know the difference between too much and just enough. He'll know if you're trying too hard, and boots that pinch make a man try too hard." Tin Man laughed, short and low, the kind of laugh that came out of him maybe twice a year, and put the church boots back in the box. They did not talk about what they were actually doing. 30-some years of riding together had built a language made mostly of things left unsaid, and this was one of them. The fact that 3 grown adults were spending a Thursday night deciding on footwear for a 1-hour visit to a room full of children none of them would ever see again after Friday. Patch understood, without needing it explained, that Deacon was not rehearsing a performance. He was building something the way he built the carving, one small true detail at a time, because he'd learned somewhere, Quezon maybe, or the years after, alone in rooms that didn't ask anything of him, that the difference between a lie and a kindness was in how much care you put into it. She left near 10. At the door she stopped and looked back at him, bent over the workbench, sanding the same spot on the motorcycle's rear fender, though it had long since gone smooth. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's bigger than tomorrow." He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer that wouldn't have sounded like more than he meant, or less than he meant, and either way it would have been a lie, so he said nothing, and she took the nothing for what it was and left him to it. The wind kept moving along the road outside, carrying the sound of a truck downshifting somewhere near the county line, and Deacon worked until the fender caught the light exactly right, and did not let himself think too hard about why it mattered so much that it did. He slept 4 hours, which was more than he'd managed most nights that year, and woke before the alarm with the particular clarity of a man who has already decided something and is only waiting for the world to catch up to the decision. The clock on the nightstand read 5:40. Outside, Black Ridge was still dark, the kind of pre-dawn dark that in October carried a wet cold that got into the joints of older men and stayed there. He lay still for a moment, listening to the house settle, then got up and dressed in the dark without turning on a light, the way he'd learned to do decades ago in a different country for different reasons. The wooden motorcycle sat on the workbench where he'd left it, finished now, the fender smooth as a river stone, the handlebars no wider than a thumbnail. He wrapped it in a shop rag and set it inside his jacket pocket, close to his chest, the way a man carries something he isn't ready to explain even to himself. He called Patch at 6. She answered on the second ring, already awake, already dressed by the sound of the gravel crunching under her boots on her end of the line. "You're really doing this," she said. It wasn't a question. 9 o'clock, he said. Roosevelt Elementary, dressed down, no colors. There was a pause long enough that he could hear a rooster somewhere behind her, and then she said, "Tin Man's coming too. Told him last night you'd need more than one set of eyes that didn't look like trouble." "I don't need. You don't get to decide that alone," she said, not unkindly, and hung up before he could argue, because she had ridden with him long enough to know that some things needed deciding for a man, not by him, He stood in the kitchen with the phone still in his hand and looked at the window, where the sky had gone the color of a healing bruise, purple fading to gray, and thought about the boy standing at the pump 2 nights before, barefoot in October, saying the words that had lodged in him like a splinter too deep to dig out. He thought about the mother's face at the diner counter, the exhaustion in it that had nothing left over for asking questions. He thought about his own son, 6 years silent, and the phone that sat on the counter that he had not picked up to call in longer than he wanted to count. He put on his jacket. The motorcycle rode against his ribs like something alive. Outside, the first gray light was catching the chrome on 3 bikes parked at careful distance from each other in the gravel lot, and somewhere down Route 9 a screen door slapped shut, and a boy who had told no one else was already awake, already watching the road, already counting the hours until 9. Patch was already leaning against her bike when he came out, arms crossed over a denim jacket instead of her cut, her gray hair pulled back tight enough to show the scar along her jaw that nobody asked about anymore. Tin Man stood a few feet off, checking his mirrors for no reason at all, the way a man does when his hands need a task and his mind doesn't have one to give them. Neither of them said good morning. They had both been awake since the call came through the night before, short and without explanation. Friday, 9 o'clock, dressed down, and both had understood, the way people who have ridden together long enough understand things, that this was not a question being asked, but a decision already made, waiting only for their bodies to arrive. The morning was cold enough to see breath in, the kind of October cold that came off the ridge in sheets and settled into the gravel lot like something poured. Deacon swung his leg over the bike and felt his knee complain, the way it always did before it warmed. An old man's ache dressed up as weather. He did not look at the others. He did not need to. Patch pulled her jacket tighter and said, "You sure about this?" Not really a question, more a formality, a box she was checking so that later, if it went wrong, she could say she'd asked. "No," Deacon said. That was the whole conversation. Tin Man grunted something that might have been agreement or might have just been his knees, and then the 3 of them were rolling out of the lot in a loose line, engines low, not the thunder they saved for runs and funerals, but something quieter, almost apologetic. 3 bikes moving through a town that was still mostly asleep, past the shuttered hardware store and the church with its marquee missing letters, past the wagon wheel with its lights already on, and a shape moving behind the counter that might have been the boy's mother, starting the coffee for a shift that had not yet ended in her mind, only paused. Deacon did not slow down as they passed it. He did not trust himself to. They rode past the quarry road without anyone mentioning it, though all 3 of them clocked the turnoff, the chained gate, the sign that still said helmets required beyond this point, as if a man could be protected from what had already happened to him there 14 months before. The sky kept lightening behind them, gray easing towards something almost blue, and ahead, the water tower came into view first. Black ridge painted in letters faded to the color of old teeth, and beneath it, low and brick and ordinary, the shape of the school waiting, the way schools always wait, patient and indifferent, for whatever the day was going to bring it. They parked the bikes at the far end of the lot, away from the flagpole and the yellow buses idling with their doors folded open like patient mouths, because Tin Man had said it without needing to say much. No sense crowding the boy before he's even walked in the door. And Deacon had nodded, because it was true, and because it gave him another minute before he had to be whatever it was he had agreed to be. The engines ticked as they cooled. Somewhere a bell system clicked on inside the building, a low electrical hum before the first bell would ring, and a woman in a cardigan the color of weak tea propped open the front doors with a rubber wedge and did not look at them twice, which Patch said afterward was the whole trick of it, dressing down enough that a stranger's eyes slid right past. Deacon stood by his bike a moment longer than the other 2, working his jaw the way he did before inspections 30 years earlier, before rooms he did not want to walk into. He was wearing a collared shirt Patch had made him iron the night before, the vest folded into his saddlebag rather than on his back, and without the leather he felt oddly unfinished, like a man who had left his own name at home. The boy was waiting just inside the fence line, alone, in a jacket too thin for the morning, holding a folder against his chest, with both arms, the way a much smaller child might hold something they were afraid to drop. He did not wave. He only watched them come up the walk, his eyes moving from Deacon's face to the two strangers beside him, cataloging, deciding. "You brought them," the boy said. Not a question. "Didn't think it'd look right. Just me," Deacon said. "Man walks in alone, talking about the club. Sounds like a story. 3 of us, it's just true." The boy considered this with the seriousness of a much older man weighing testimony. "Are they going to talk too?" "If you want them to." The boy looked at Patch, at the silver in her braid and the steadiness of her, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch, the way a held breath finally lets go. He looked at Tin Man, at the forearms like knotted rope, and did not look away as most children did. "Okay," the boy said, and turned toward the doors, and did not check to see if they were following, which Deacon understood later was its own kind of trust. The boy had already decided, somewhere between the gas station and this morning, that they would be there, and had simply been waiting to see if the world would confirm what he already believed. Behind them, the first bell rang, thin and metallic, scattering a knot of children across the yard, and the 4 of them walked into the school together, as the day the boy had been dreading quietly became the day he had asked for instead. The hallway smelled of floor wax and pencil shavings, and the particular must of a building that had been holding children inside its walls for 60 years, and Deacon felt it settle over him the way old smells do, dragging up rooms he had not thought about in a long time. A schoolhouse in another state, another decade, his own son small enough to carry on a shoulder. He pushed the thought down the way he had learned to push most things down, and followed the boys straight back past a bulletin board, papered with orange construction paper leaves, each one bearing a child's name in careful pencil, until they stopped outside a door with a paper turkey taped beneath a laminated sign that read MRS, Halloran, Room 14. The boy did not knock. He put his hand flat on the door as if testing whether it was real, and then pushed it open. Inside, the room was already half full of parents standing awkwardly beside their children's desks. A dentist in scrubs, a woman in a bank blazer, a man in a hard hat holding it against his chest like a hymnal. Mrs. Halloran stood at the front, a tall woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, clipboard in hand, and when she saw the boy come through the door flanked by 3 strangers in leather, something crossed her face that was not quite alarm and not quite relief, but a fast recalculation, teacher's arithmetic, checking a column that had been empty all week. "Good morning," she said, to the room and to them. The boy walked to his desk without looking at anyone, sat, and folded his hands the way he must have been taught, though his knuckles were white. Deacon felt Patch beside him and Tin Man on his other side, 3 men and 1 woman, standing where the doorway opened into a room full of children who had never seen anyone like them, except maybe on the side of a highway, going the other direction, gone before anyone could look twice. A few kids had gone quiet. One boy near the window said, "Too loud. Are you a gang?" And Patch said, "No, honey, we're a club. There's a difference," in a voice so even and unbothered that the boy who'd asked seemed almost disappointed not to have caused more trouble. Mrs. Halloran cleared her throat and consulted her clipboard, though Deacon suspected she already knew the order. "We have time for 4 before the bell," she said. "Who'd like to start?" The dentist volunteered, and the room settled into the particular hush of children pretending to be interested in fluoride, and Deacon found a spot along the back wall between a coat rack and a poster of the food pyramid, watching the boy's shoulders, waiting, the way he had waited on convoy roads at night, for something he couldn't yet see, but knew was coming. The dentist talked about cavities and gave out toothbrushes shaped like alligators, and the children clapped the way children clap for anything given to them for free. A woman who worked at the post office spoke next, holding up a canceled stamp like it was a coin from some distant empire, and the boy near the window who had asked about the gang raised his hand to ask if she had ever found money in the mail, and she said once, and did not elaborate, and the room seemed satisfied with that. Deacon watched the boy through all of it. He sat 2 rows from the front, hands folded on the desk the way a much older man folds his hands at a funeral, watching the clock more than he watched the dentist or the postal worker, and Deacon understood that the boy was not passing time. He was enduring it. A father in a fire department polo went third, and Deacon felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the particular cruelty of coincidence. A boy in the front row leaning forward at every word about ladders and hoses. A boy who Deacon guessed had a father who came home every night to a house with 2 cars in the driveway. The fireman finished. Mrs. Halloran checked her clipboard again, though her eyes went first to the back wall, to the 3 of them standing there like weather that had rolled in off the highway. "And our last speaker before recess," she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, "is going to talk to us about motorcycles." The boy's shoulders came up an inch. Not turning, not looking, just a small lift, the kind of movement a man makes in his sleep when a door opens somewhere in the house. Deacon stepped away from the coat rack. His boots sounded too loud on the linoleum, and he was aware of every patch on his vest, every fading line of ink on his forearms, in a way he hadn't been aware of them in 20 years, the way a man becomes aware of his own hands when someone he wants to impress is watching him use them. He did not look at the boy as he crossed the room. He had learned that much on the ride over, watching Patch not look at things that mattered, and Tin Man not look at the road signs counting down the miles. You didn't spend your attention where everyone could see it. You saved it. He reached the front of the room and turned to face 24 children who had never seen anyone like him except from a car window, and one child who had asked him to be something he was not, for 1 hour, and Deacon cleared his throat, the way he imagined a father might, and began. He talked about tires first, because tires were something a child could hold in his mind. The tread, the pressure, the way rubber remembered the road it had traveled. He said a motorcycle was mostly balance, and balance was mostly patience, and patience was mostly deciding not to panic in the half-second when everything wanted to tip over. He did not use those words. He said it the way a man says something to a room of 8-year-olds, plain and slow, and Mrs. Halloran stood at the back with her arms folded and her eyes doing something he chose not to name. He talked about the war for exactly 9 seconds, because that was as much as he trusted himself with in that room, and what he said was, "I drove trucks, and I came home, and some of my friends didn't." He did not elaborate. A boy in the second row asked if he'd ever been shot at, and Deacon said yes, and the room went the particular kind of quiet that children make when they understand, without being told, that a subject has closed. He talked about the club last, and this was where his voice changed, though he could not have said how. He told them a motorcycle club was like a family that chose each other after the fact, that some men needed choosing more than once in their life, because the first family they were given didn't always hold. He did not look at the boy when he said this. He looked at the window, at the flagpole outside going through its small daily argument with the wind, and let the sentence land wherever it was going to land. The boy sat in the front row, with his hands folded on the desk, the way Mrs. Halloran had likely taught them, spine straighter than any 8-year-old's spine had business being, and watched Deacon the way men in prison yards watch new arrivals, cataloging, deciding, filing away for later use. Deacon had been watched like that before, by younger men sizing up whether an old biker was still dangerous or only looked it. He had never been watched like that by a child. Near the end he took the wooden shape from his jacket pocket, unfinished still, one wheel not yet rounded, and set it on the boy's desk without ceremony, the way a man sets down tools he intends to pick back up. "Not done yet," he said. "Man doesn't hand off a thing before it's finished." The boy's fingers moved toward it and stopped, an inch short, as if touching it now might use up whatever it was going to become. Patch, by the door, had gone very still. Tin Man had taken off his cap without seeming to notice he'd done it. The clock above the chalkboard read 9:41. 9:41. Deacon would remember that number for 30 years the way a man remembers the mile marker where his truck went into the ditch, arbitrary, meaningless to anyone else, load-bearing to him. Mrs. Halloran had risen from her desk at the back of the room without a sound, the way certain women learn to move around men who might startle, and she was watching the boy's hand hover over the unfinished motorcycle with an expression Deacon didn't have a word for yet. He would get one later. Recognition, maybe, or witness. The boy's hand came back to his lap. He folded it over the other one, same as before, like nothing had happened, like a strange man in a leather vest hadn't just told a room full of 8-year-olds that a thing isn't given until it's finished. "What's it going to be?" A boy in the second row asked, not raising his hand, forgetting the rule the way children forget rules in the presence of something interesting. "Motorcycle," Deacon said. "Same one I ride. Same one that's parked out there in your lot right now, if your teacher'll let you look at it after." Mrs. Halloran said nothing, which Deacon understood to mean yes. The boy did not ask when it would be finished. That was the thing Deacon turned over later, riding home, and later still, decades later, standing at a chain-link fence with a program folded soft as cloth in his vest pocket. The boy hadn't asked when. Other kids would have asked when. This one had learned, at 8, in 14 months, that asking when a thing arrives doesn't make it arrive any sooner, and that some questions only remind you of what you don't have. Tin Man's cap stayed in his hands. He turned it once, slow, the way he did when something needed doing with his hands that wasn't smoking a cigarette, which he couldn't do in a schoolroom, and Deacon caught his eye across the room, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a way to say it that wouldn't sound foolish in front of children. The clock ticked to 9:42. Deacon picked the wooden shape back up, unhurried, the way he'd have picked up a wrench mid-job, and returned it to his jacket pocket, and the boy watched it go the way a man watches a train pull out of a station he intends to catch again. Not desperate, just certain he'd be there when it came back around. 18 more minutes, Deacon said, mostly to himself, checking the clock like a man checking a gauge. Mrs. Halloran sat back down. Somewhere down the hall a bell rang for a different class. Wrong pitch, wrong hour, and nobody in the room so much as flinched. Deacon let the 18 minutes work on him, the way a long haul works on a man's spine, in small increments he wouldn't notice until later. A girl in the front row raised her hand and asked if motorcycles were scared of rain, and he told her machines don't feel scared, only careless men do, and that a careless man on a wet road was a man who hadn't respected the road enough to begin with. The girl nodded like she'd file that away somewhere permanent. Beside her, a boy with a cowlick asked if he'd ever been shot at, and the room went still in that particular way children's rooms go still, and Deacon said yes, once, a long time ago, in a place far from here, and that the getting shot at wasn't the part worth remembering, it was who dragged you out of it after. He didn't elaborate. Mrs. Halloran's pen had stopped moving on her legal pad. The boy in the third row hadn't asked anything. He hadn't needed to. He sat with his hands flat on the desk, the posture of someone guarding a border, and every so often his eyes moved to Deacon's jacket pocket like he was tracking a heartbeat through fabric. Patch had gone quiet too, arms loose across her chest, watching the room the way she watched a stretch of two-lane before committing the pack to it, reading weather that hadn't arrived yet. She caught Deacon's eye once, and something passed between them that wasn't quite a question. He answered it with the smallest shift of his jaw, the kind of signal that meant, not yet, but soon, though neither of them could have said soon for what. Tin Man finally set the cap down on his knee, done turning it, and folded his hands instead, and that stillness was its own kind of statement. He'd ridden convoy through worse silences than this one, and knew how to sit inside them without flinching. 9:50 came and went. The clock's second hand made its rounds with the patience of something that had never once cared whether a room was happy or grieving, and Deacon found himself grateful for that indifference, the way he was sometimes grateful for the flat, unbothered hum of the highway at 2 a.m. Steady, uncomplicated, asking nothing of him but forward motion. Mrs. Halloran rose again, smoothed her skirt, and said they had time for one more question, just one, and scanned the room for a hand that wasn't going to come from the third row. It was the boy who broke his own silence then, voice small but not shaking, aimed straight at Deacon like a nail finding wood. "What happens to it?" he asked. "When the hour's over." Deacon didn't answer right away. He'd learned that much from 30 years of engines, that the pause before you speak is sometimes the only honest part of what you say. He looked at the boy, not at the class, not at Mrs. Halloran hovering by the window with her hands folded, like she was praying without moving her lips, and he said, "The hour doesn't end. It just changes clothes." The boy's brow furrowed, the way a kid's does when a truth is too big to fit through the door it came in on, and he waited for more, so Deacon gave him more. You'll walk out of here at 10 o'clock and I'll ride on. And tomorrow you'll be back at your desk and I'll be back at the shop. But you'll remember this. And remembering isn't nothing. Some things you carry the same as a tool in a bag. You don't use it every day, but you know exactly where it is. Patch, by the coat rack, had gone very still. Tin Man's hands had stopped their folding. Somewhere down the hall a door closed, ordinary and far away, and the sound seemed to belong to another building entirely. The boy nodded, like he was filing the answer somewhere specific, behind his ribs maybe, and didn't ask anything else. Mrs. Halloran cleared her throat and said it was almost 10, and thanked their guest, her voice thinner than it had been at 9 o'clock, worn down at the edges the way rope gets before it finally holds. Deacon reached into the canvas bag he'd carried in without explaining, and the room's attention swung to it the way a compass swings north. He drew out the wooden motorcycle he'd carved over 3 nights at his kitchen table, sanding it under a single bulb long after the shop radio had gone quiet, the wheels no bigger than quarters, the handlebars notched by a blade he'd sharpened that morning, out of some instinct he hadn't examined too closely. He set it in the boy's palm, the way you'd hand someone something alive. "For the hour?" he said. "So you've got proof it happened, case anybody asks?" The boy's fingers closed around it slow, like he was afraid it might not survive being held too hard. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He looked up instead, and there was something in his face that Deacon would spend the next 30 years failing to fully name. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition, or the particular relief of a kid who has just learned that adults can, on occasion, keep a promise nobody made them write down. The bell rang then, flat and mechanical, indifferent as the clock had been, cutting the room in half between what had just happened and whatever came next. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and Mrs. Halloran, moving toward the door to marshal the exodus, caught Deacon's eye across the noise and held it 1 second longer than politeness required. The children filed out in a loose, chattering current, backpacks bumping against desk corners, someone's mother already in the hallway asking too loudly whether it had gone well. Deacon stood and felt his knees announce themselves the way they always did after sitting too long on furniture built for people a third his size. Patch was already gathering the folding photographs from the desk, sliding them back into the manila envelope with the particular care of a woman who understood that some objects mattered more than their weight suggested. Tin Man hadn't moved from his corner. He was watching the boy, who was watching the little wooden motorcycle in his palm, as though it might, if he looked away, cease to exist. Mrs. Halloran reached the door last, holding it for the final stragglers, and when the room had nearly emptied, she crossed to where Deacon stood buttoning his jacket against a cold that wasn't in the building yet, but would be waiting outside it. "He hasn't spoken above a whisper in class since September," she said. Her voice was pitched low, meant for him alone. "Not to me, not to the other children. I want you to understand what you just did in this room, because I don't think you do." Deacon didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't have sounded like he was fishing for more of what she was offering. "He didn't tell anyone," she said. "Not his mother, not the office, not me, until this morning, when he walked in already dressed for it, like it was settled." She glanced toward the hallway, where the boy had stopped near the coat hooks, still holding the toy, still not moving toward the door his classmates had already vanished through. "Whatever you 3 are," she said, "wherever you go after this, I wanted you to have that." He carried the whole thing alone. 2 days of it. Nobody knew. The word, alone, landed somewhere under Deacon's sternum and stayed there, heavier than it should have been for 6 letters. He looked past her to the boy, who had finally started toward the door, the motorcycle disappearing into the pocket of a coat, 2 sizes too big, purchased, Deacon guessed, with growing room built in on purpose. The boy didn't look back at him, didn't wave, just walked out into the hallway light with his shoulders set in a way they hadn't been set an hour earlier, and was gone around the corner before Deacon could decide whether he'd wanted him to turn around at all. Patch touched his arm. "We should go," she said. "Before the front office decides 3 grown men in a 3rd-grade classroom needs explaining to somebody with a badge." Deacon nodded, but he didn't move yet. He was still looking at the empty doorway, and at the particular kind of quiet a room holds after something has been given away in it. They walked out through the front doors into an October morning that had turned brighter than it had any business being, the sun flat and white against the flagpole, the parking lot smelling of dead leaves and diesel from the buses idling at the curb. Tin Man lit a cigarette he didn't finish, just held between two fingers while it burned down on its own. Nobody talked. There didn't seem to be anything that wanted saying out loud. Not yet. Not in a lot full of minivans and a crossing guard watching three strangers on foot, with the particular suspicion small towns reserve for anyone who isn't already known to them. The bikes were parked at the far end, past the buses, where Deacon had left them angled so the chrome wouldn't catch a stray kickball. He put his hand on the seat of his and didn't get on. Patch noticed. She noticed most things before he said them, which was most of what made her good at her job, and occasionally unbearable as a friend. "You're thinking about the boy," she said. "I'm thinking about the mother." "Same thing, most days." He didn't answer that. He was thinking about a woman with a coffee pot at 11 at night, about a coat bought 2 sizes big on purpose, about a word. Alone. That a teacher had used the way you'd use a scalpel, precise and necessary, and not meant to be comfortable. He was thinking that somewhere between the gas station on Route 9 and this parking lot, something in him that had been shut for 6 years had come open a crack, not all the way, but enough that air was getting in where it hadn't before. Tin Man dropped his cigarette and ground it out under a boot that had seen 3 decades of worse. "You gonna tell me what that was in there?" he said, "or am I supposed to guess for the rest of my life?" "It was an hour," Deacon said. Didn't look like an hour. Looked like something. Patch was already swinging a leg over her bike, settling into it the way she settled into most things, without ceremony. "It was both," she said. "That's usually how it works." They rode out of the lot single file, past the flagpole, past the crossing guard who lowered her sign a half-second late, out onto the 2-lane that would take them back toward the highway, and the clubhouse, and whatever the rest of that Friday intended to be. Deacon didn't look at the school in his mirror. He didn't need to. He could still see the doorway, still see the shoulders that had straightened themselves out somewhere in the space of 60 minutes, and he understood, without being able to say it in words yet, that he had just done something he wasn't finished doing. The clubhouse that evening smelled the way it always did on a Friday, motor oil and coffee gone bitter on the burner, cigarette smoke pressed into the beams overhead by 20 years of habit. 22 members did not all fit comfortably around the long table that had been salvaged from a bowling alley in 1988, but that had never stopped them from trying, and that night more of them tried than usual, because word had already gotten around before Deacon's bike was even cool in the lot. He told it plain. He didn't dress it up, didn't make himself the hero of it, because he didn't feel like one. He told them about the vest and the folding chair and the boy's hand going up when nobody expected it, and about the wood shavings on the floor of a 3rd-grade classroom, and when he got to the part about the carving, he stopped talking with his hands the way he usually did and just looked at the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then somebody in the back, younger prospect, Patch not even a year old, asked the question that was sitting in most of their chests. "Why'd you do it?" Not accusing. Just wanting to understand a man who didn't do things like that. Deacon thought about the diner counter at 11 at night, the woman's hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from, the exhaustion sitting on her like a coat 2 sizes too heavy. He thought about his own son, 6 years gone from his phone calls, and how a boy 2 states away might be sitting somewhere right now, needing something Deacon hadn't given him in a long time. He didn't say any of that. Because he asked, Deacon said, and nobody else was going to. That seemed to be enough. The table went back to its noise. Somebody dealing cards, somebody arguing about a carburetor, Tin Man retelling the flagpole and the crossing guard to a corner of members who hadn't heard it yet, embellishing nothing because it didn't need embellishing. Patch sat apart from it, near the window, watching the parking lot go dark, and when Deacon came and stood beside her, she didn't look over. "You're going to think about that kid for the rest of your life," she said. "You know that." "Maybe. Not maybe. I saw your face when he took that horse." She finally turned. "That's not a maybe face." Outside, the temperature had dropped the way October evenings did in Black Ridge, sudden and complete, and somewhere past the tree line, a truck downshifted on the grade leading out of town. Deacon didn't answer her. He was already turning something over that he hadn't said out loud yet, not even to himself in full. A phone number he still knew by heart. A silence he had let sit for 6 years like a debt neither side wanted to be first to pay. He carried the number out to the lot with him, the way he'd carried it every day for 6 years without ever once dialing it, and he sat on the bike a long while before he started it, helmet on his knee, the clubhouse light throwing a long yellow rectangle across the gravel. Somewhere inside, the party kept going without him, and that was fine. Some things a man had to do alone, or not do at all. He didn't call that night. He told himself the hour was wrong, that his son kept early mornings now, a job with a schedule, a wife Deacon had met exactly twice. He told himself a lot of things riding home under a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, and none of them were true, and he knew it the whole way. What he did instead, 3 days later, was write it down. Not a letter exactly, he wasn't a letter-writing man, but a page, in the back of the same notebook where he kept mileage and oil changes, where a man like him kept the things too heavy to hand to somebody outright. He wrote about a boy in a classroom who had stood up straight for the first time in 14 months. He wrote about a wooden horse shape that wasn't a horse. He wrote, near the bottom, "A kid asked a stranger to be his father for an hour, and I said yes, and I don't know why I couldn't say yes to my own." He didn't send the page, he put it in a drawer, the way men like him put things in drawers, and told himself that was a start, though it wasn't, not yet. The following week, the meal arrived at the clubhouse gate, a covered dish, still faintly warm, left with no note and no need for one, because everyone who saw it understood exactly what it was and where it had come from, and why nobody knocked to hand it over in person. Tin Man carried it inside, like it was something consecrated. Patch said the woman must have asked around, must have found out which building held the men who'd sat in her son's classroom, and decided that was thanks enough. No confrontation, no scene, just food on a step, the oldest language there was. Deacon ate a plate of it standing at the counter, alone, and didn't say much, and nobody made him. It was Mrs. Halloran, 3 weeks after that, standing on the school steps in a coat too thin for the wind, who told him the other half of what he hadn't known, that the boy had never told his mother any of it beforehand, not one word, that whatever had happened between the gas station and that Friday morning had happened entirely inside an 8-year-old's silence, carried alone, the way some children carry things far past what they should ever have to. Deacon thought about that for a long time afterward, longer even than he thought he would. He carried it a certain way, that piece of information, the way a man carries a stone in his boot he has decided not to stop and shake out. It changed nothing about what had already happened. It only deepened it, the way a photograph deepens when you learn who took it and why they were standing where they were standing. He called his own son that winter. Not right away, not with any speech prepared. He sat at the kitchen table with the phone in front of him for 3 nights before he picked it up on the 4th, and when the boy, a grown man himself by then, 31 years old, with a wife Deacon had met exactly twice, answered on the 2nd ring, Deacon didn't lead with an apology, because he didn't have the words for one yet, and he'd learned enough in his life not to fake words he didn't have. He said his son's name. He said he'd been thinking about him. He said the weather had turned and he hoped the roads out that way weren't too bad for driving, and his son said they were fine, and that was the whole conversation. 4 minutes, nothing solved, 6 years of silence not repaired but interrupted, which Deacon understood by then was sometimes the only kind of repair a man gets offered, and he'd be a fool to wait for a better one. He didn't tell the club much about that call. Tin Man knew. Patch guessed. Nobody asked him to explain the timing of it, though everyone at the clubhouse who'd heard about the classroom, about the wooden bike, about the boy who'd asked a stranger at a gas pump to be his father for 60 minutes, understood well enough where the nerve had been touched. 22 members strong, that chapter, and somehow it felt to Deacon like all 22 of them knew a version of the story by Christmas, retold at the bar, softened at the edges the way stories get softened by men who don't have the vocabulary for tenderness and have to smuggle it in sideways, through a joke that isn't really a joke, through somebody clapping him on the shoulder a little too long. The boy, meanwhile, went on being a boy. Deacon didn't see him again that year, or the next. Life did what life does, pulled people down separate roads, the mother's shifts, the biker's miles, the ordinary current of years that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask permission, just moves. Deacon told himself, now and then, that he'd hear how the kid turned out. Small towns leak news eventually, one way or another, and Black Ridge was small enough. But 30 years is a long current to hold your breath against, and Deacon, riding out toward Roosevelt Elementary on the morning of its last bell, did not yet know what that current had carried the boy into. The chain-link fence around Roosevelt Elementary was warm under Deacon's hand, the October sun doing what October sun does in Black Ridge. Thin, gold, unhurried, the kind of light that makes old brick look like it's remembering something. Behind him, the parking lot held maybe a dozen cars and one flatbed already backed against the gym wall, waiting for Monday, when the machines would come and undo 40 years of a building in an afternoon. He had the folded paper program in his vest pocket, soft at the creases now, the ink gone the color of weak tea. He hadn't planned to bring it. His hand had found it in the drawer that morning, the way hands find things they've been waiting 30 years for an excuse to touch. He didn't hear the boots on gravel until they stopped beside him. The man was broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of ladders and turnout gear, hair cut close, a faint white scar along one forearm that Deacon recognized without knowing why. Recognized the way you recognize a kind of wear, not a face. He was looking at the same window Deacon was looking at, third from the corner, second floor, Mrs. Halloran's old room. Neither of them said anything for a while. The flag on its pole ticked once in a breath of wind. "They're ringing it one more time," the man said finally. "At 10. Same as always." Deacon nodded. He didn't ask the question sitting in his chest, because some part of him already knew the answer, the way you know weather is coming before the sky changes. The man's eyes dropped to the pocket where the paper showed a corner, then came back up. "I kept the motorcycle," he said. 30 years. It's on a shelf at the station house now, next to my helmet." Deacon's breath went somewhere and didn't come back right away. "Firefighter," the man said, as if that explained the rest of it, and maybe it did. They stood at the fence without moving closer, without embracing, without any of the things a lesser telling of this would have demanded. Just two men and a strip of chain link and 30 years folded down small enough to fit in a shirt pocket. "That hour," the man said, "didn't just get me through career day." He was quiet a moment, watching the empty windows. "It taught me what to look for in every man since." The bell rang at 10 exactly, the same flat brass note it had always rung. And somewhere inside the building, children who would never sit in those rooms again filed out into the sun for the last time. Deacon rode home with the program tucked back in his vest, warm against his chest the whole way, and understood, finally, that being chosen once, for an hour, could outlast almost anything built to last forever.